A small overhead lamp lights your tiny new world. The memory of the crash, the rank odor of your surroundings, the pounding of the sea, the moaning wind, and your plan to reboard solo in the morning roll over and over in your brain. Surely it'll end soon. You're lost about halfway between a rock and a hard place. You don't think the Atlantic has emptier waters. You're about 450 miles north of the Cape Verde Islands, but they stand across the wind. You can drift only in the direction she blows. Downwind, 450 miles separate you from the nearest shipping lanes. Caribbean islands are the closest possible landfall, 1,800 nautical miles away. Don't think of it. Plan for the day instead. You have hope if the raft lasts. Will it last? The sea continues to attack. It doesn't always give warning. Often the curl develops just before it strikes. The roar accompanies the crash, beating the raft and ripping at it. You hear a growl a long way off, toward the heart of the storm. It builds like a crescendo, growing louder and louder until it consumes all of the air around you. The fist of Neptune strikes, and with its blast, the raft is shot to a staggering halt. It squawks and screams, and then there's peace. As though you've passed into the realm of the afterlife where you can't be tortured any further. Quickly, you yank open the observation port and stick your head out. Solo's jib is still snapping and her rudder clapping, but you're drifting away. Her electrics have been fused together, and the strobe light on the top of her mast blinks a goodbye to you. You watch for a long time as the flashes of light become visible less often. Knowing it is the last you'll see of her, feeling as if you've lost a friend and a part of yourself. An occasional flash appears, and then nothing. She's lost in the raging sea. You pull up the line that had tied you to your friend, your hope for food and water and clothing. The rope is in one piece. Perhaps the loop you had tied in the main sheet broke during the last shock. Or the knot. Maybe it was the knot. The vibration and surging might have shaken it loose. Or maybe you made a mistake when tying it. You've tied thousands of bowlines. It's a process as familiar to you as turning a key. Still, it doesn't matter anymore. No regrets. You simply wonder if this has saved you. Did your tiny rubber home escape just before it was torn to pieces? Or will being set adrift kill you in the end? These are your thoughts. These are your actions. These are your experiences, and you have just started day 1 of your 76 days being lost at sea. This is the story of Steven Callahan and the sinking of his ship, the Napoleon Solo. This is part 1 of a 2-part series talking about Mr. Callahan's harrowing experience. First, whole experience. Before we start the story, let's learn a little bit about the man himself, his philosophy on life, and his life before going adrift in the ocean. Callahan believes that the beginning and end of a story can be hard to define, but some experiences have very distinct dividing lines. He calls these special experiences whole experiences. Everyone listening has had a few whole experiences in their life already. Graduating from school, breaking a limb, your first heartbreak, or whatever other moments in your life that you've subconsciously classified as a benchmark. Callahan believes the first 29 years of his life represent a whole experience. Within those 29 years, seeds had been planted and would eventually be sown in his next whole experience. The most important of those seeds was planted in 1964, when at the age of 12, Steven Callahan began sailing. He fell in love with sailing instantly. He found the simplified lifestyle that was necessitated by sailing to be devoid of modern inconveniences. He found sailing to be unapologetically beautiful, and most importantly, everything about it felt right. At some point, he became enthralled with the history of the sailing ship and the age of sail. Sorry to pivot here for a minute. I recognize I'm hitting you with some jargon and terms you may not be familiar with. So to keep everyone on the same page, I'll be making clarifying asides when I feel like it'll either help you understand what's going on or help with imagining the scenario. Side note. A sailing ship is a large vessel that uses sails mounted on masts to harness the power of wind to propel itself through the sea. For a quick visual that I think most people listening will understand, just imagine all of the ships from Pirates of the Caribbean. Of course, there are many different types of sailing ships with different names, but that could probably be an episode all on its own. The Age of Sail is a period in European history that lasted from approximately the mid-15th to the mid-19th centuries, in which the dominance of sailing ships in global trade and warfare culminated, particularly marked by the introduction of naval artillery. Okay, back to the story. Callahan yearns for the romanticism and adventures of ages past, a sentiment I'm sure all of us can empathize with. Well, shortly after he'd begun sailing, he read a book named Tinkerbell by Robert Manry. In June of 1965, Robert Manry started a voyage where he sailed his 13.5-foot boat across the Atlantic Ocean in 78 days, at the time setting a record for smallest boat ever to have crossed the Atlantic. There was something about the simplicity of Manry's boat and being able to accomplish so much with so little that it struck a chord in Callahan's heart. Robert Manry had just shown a young Steven Callahan that a life of adventure was still possible in the latter part of the 20th century. From that point forward, he dreamed of crossing the Atlantic in a small boat. As the years passed, he learned the skills necessary to accomplish his goal. Before he was out of high school, he'd helped to build a 40-footer. By 1974, he'd started down his path of a boat-building career and was living on board the ship. By 1977, he was designing boats and sailing as far as Bermuda. By 1979, he was designing and teaching design full-time. All these years, the story of Manry and Tinkerbell stayed in his mind, giving his life a focus and serving as an inspiration. In 1980, Callahan sold his 29-foot trimaran and put all of his resources into creating a small cruiser, the Napoleon Solo. Side note, a small cruiser is a sailing boat that is quite manageable in terms of its length. The designation small cruiser is generally given to sailing boats that do not exceed the 10-meter mark in overall length. The design of the Napoleon Solo, in Callahan's words, was unusual, though not at all radical. The Napoleon Solo became much more than a boat to Callahan. He knew the ins and outs of that ship like the back of his hand, and said of his creation, quote, "It was as if I'd created a living being," end quote. Callahan, along with a friend of his named Chris Latcham, gave the Napoleon Solo a 1,000-mile shakedown cruise from Annapolis to Massachusetts. Side note, a shakedown cruise is a nautical term in which the performance of a ship is tested. Generally, shakedown cruises are performed before a ship enters service or after major changes such as a crew change, repair, refit, or overhaul. A shakedown cruise simulates working conditions for the vessel for various reasons. For most new ships, the major reasons are to familiarize a crew with the new vessel and to ensure all of the ship's systems are functional. Basically, it's a way to stress test the ship and get the crew familiar with it under sailing conditions. When I was in the Navy, I don't think there was ever a period of time throughout my service where the ship that I was stationed wasn't in a shakedown period, excluding dry dock. Long story short, Callahan put his boat through the ringer. Back to the story. By spring of 1981, Callahan felt ready enough to follow in Manry's wake. He didn't care about setting any kind of record. The Napoleon Solo was slightly over 21 feet long. For Callahan, this crossing was more of a pilgrimage he needed to make. It would also serve as a way to test his competence as a seaman, designer, and craftsman. He felt like if he could make it to England safely, he'd have accomplished everything he'd ever set out for himself. He sails the Napoleon Solo from Newport, Rhode Island to Bermuda, and in Bermuda he plans to meet up with his friend Chris Latcham to make the crossing to England. When he leaves the US, he practically leaves with everything he owns. Insurance brokers avoided him like the plague, and the ones that didn't set such high premiums that, in Callahan's words, it would cost less to buy materials for a second boat. He figures the worst thing that could happen would be him getting killed, and if he's dead, then he wouldn't be too worried about collecting any kind of insurance payout. The second worst thing would obviously be the loss of Napoleon Solo. A lot of people couldn't understand why Callahan wanted to take such a potentially dangerous trip. Callahan believes that the first time he'd ever left shore on a boat all those years ago, his soul was touched. He says that on his first offshore trip to Bermuda, he'd begun to think of the sea as his chapel. As far as he was concerned, he didn't have a choice because his soul was telling him to make this pilgrimage. I'm not trying to pretty up the language here either. A lot of the words I'm using are directly from the man himself and the book that he wrote. Even still, people could not understand him and why it was something he had to do. A friend eventually told him to write down his thoughts as a way to help all of the people that thought he was crazy understand just a little bit more. Callahan follows his friend's advice and goes on to write probably one of the most beautiful passages I've had the pleasure of reading. While waiting for Chris in Bermuda, this is what Callahan writes.
I wish I could describe the feeling of being at sea. The anguish, frustration, and fear, the beauty that accompanies threatening spectacles, the spiritual communion with creatures in whose domain I sail. There is a magnificent intensity in life that comes when we are not in control, but are only reacting, living, surviving. I'm not a religious man per se. My own cosmology is convoluted and not in line with any particular church or philosophy, but for me, to go to sea is to get a glimpse of the face of God. At sea, I am reminded of my insignificance, of all men's insignificance. It is a wonderful feeling to be so humble. End quote.
So, now that we know a little bit more about the man and what he considers his first whole experience, it's time we move on and talk about the next chapter in his life. Dark clouds in Penzance. It was late at night and a dense fog has blanketed the area for days. The Napoleon Solo continues to sail through the sea toward the coast of England, specifically the Isles of Scilly. Callahan and Chris continue with care. There are large tides and the shipping lanes are heavily traveled, making the potential for collision with a larger ship a very real possibility. Chris and Callahan remain vigilant and are able to navigate the area successfully. The next morning, the Napoleon Solo makes its way out of the white fog and over the swells. They slowly slip into Mounts Bay. The route that Callahan and Chris have taken has them sail past a town named Mousehole towards where Penzance is nestled. Penzance is a town in Cornwall, England, and the bay that leads up to the town has many dangers of its own. One of the most famous of those dangers being a large pile of rocks that have been named the Lizard. They pull into port, moor the ship to the pier, and have successfully completed Napoleon Solo's crossing of the Atlantic. A dream that Callahan has had for the last 15 years. A dream that has guided him for more than half of his life has been finally realized. Robert Manry made this trip all those years ago in the Tinkerbell. Callahan did it in the Napoleon Solo. Callahan and Chris look for customs and the nearest pub to grab their first beer in weeks. With Chris in the Napoleon Solo, Callahan concludes this chapter of his life. Surprised? A man has a 15-year-long dream, accomplishes it, and it wasn't the thing he ended up being known for or writing a book about. It didn't even get more than a few pages in his book. Life works in mysterious ways sometimes. Soon after, Chris departs and leaves Callahan to continue this journey alone. It's time for new dreams, and that new dream includes entering the Mini Transat.
Side note, the Mini Transat is a sailing race that takes you from Penzance, England, to the Canary Islands and concludes in Antigua. It is what's called a single-handed race, meaning that it can only be performed by a crew of one, so it has to be done alone. Back to the story.
The Napoleon Solo is a fast-moving boat, and Callahan is eager to see how it stands against the other racers. He believes that he actually has a very good shot at being competitive, The reason for this confidence is that he considered himself to be very well prepared in comparison to the competition. Some of the other racers are doing last-minute installations of bulkheads, marking their sails for the race with magic marker. In contrast, last-minute prep for Callahan was sampling the local beer. Despite the seemingly laid-back approach Callahan was taking during this time, he knew that this race was no joke. It was the autumn equinox, and that means stormy weather. While he's waiting for race day, during one of the weeks, 2 large gales tear up the English Channel, ships were broken, and a lot of the Transat racers were actually delayed in their arrival because of it. A dark cloud begins to loom over the race because the Lizard has taken a victim. A Frenchman's body, as well as pieces of his boat, were found dashed against the rocks. In his time spent in Penzance, Callahan befriends the local chandler, a man named Old Willoughby. He's bow-legged, squat, hobbles around his shop, and is a blunt man. A pipe clamped between his teeth, he says to Callahan, who has shown up in his shop for some last-minute race supplies.
"Oh, I heard about the Frenchman. Why you fellas go to sea for pleasure is beyond me. Of course we had some fine times in my day, real fine times we had. But that was our stock in trade. A fellow'd go to sea for pleasure, or should go to hell for a pastime."
At least you'd have somebody to keep you company then, Mr. Willoughby.
"It's a bad business, I tell you. Bad business. Sorry thing, that Frenchman. What do you get if you win this here race? Big prize?"
No, I don't really know. Maybe a plastic cup or something?
A fine state of affairs. You go out, play tag with Neptune, have a good chance to end up in old Davy Jones' locker, all for a cup. It's a good joke.
Callahan leaves with his supplies, and we have a bit of foreshadow. Sailors since the beginning have always been superstitious, and the shadow of the Frenchman's death looms large over the town. The morning of the race, Callahan makes it to the skipper's meeting, and whether or not the race will even start on time has been up in the air for the last few days. The racers are all told to expect heavy winds, and that if they can weather the Finisterre, they should be fine. They're told that within 36 hours, all hell is going to break loose, and that there's a good chance of force 10 to force 12 winds and 40-foot waves. For my fellow Americans, force 10 winds, also known as storm or whole gale winds, are winds that can reach speeds of 48 to 55 knots or 55 to 63 miles per hour. So, at a minimum, we're dealing with 55 mile per hour storm winds, and at the worst, 83 mile an hour hurricane winds. To put things more into perspective for you, the naval ship I was stationed on was close to 400 feet long, and 15-foot waves put most of our crew down with seasickness. The ships on the TV show Deadliest Catch are all over 100 feet long, and they have to be cautious when dealing with 30-foot waves. The Mini Transat is a 6.5 meter race at the absolute upper limit. We're talking about a 21-foot long ship having to potentially deal with 45-plus foot waves by yourself. The thought of that is terrifying, and it might be difficult for someone that hasn't sailed or been in comparable conditions to truly fathom it. A debate breaks out between the racers, and the race organizer is eventually able to get everyone on the same page. The organizer reminds them that if they delay, then they may be locked in the bay for weeks, and that they'd all known the risks beforehand. Callahan's anxious, but soon that anxiety fades and is replaced with excitement. He waits for the signal. Over as soon as it started. Smoke erupts from the gun and disappears before Callahan can even hear its report. The race has officially begun. Sure enough, the Napoleon Solo leads the fleet in the race. At night, Callahan is able to see the lights of the other ships, but by the next morning, there isn't a ship in sight. The bad conditions soon end, and slicing through the waves, he eventually sees a ship in the distance. It's the aluminum hull of a ship captained by one of the 2 Italians that were in the race. He learns later that day over comms that the Italian's ship had sunk, but luckily the man himself was rescued. Day 3 of the race, Callahan passes a freighter who confirms that they've seen 22 of the 26 boats in the race. On this day, Callahan needs to make a choice between sailing into the Bay of Biscay and trying to use the strong winds to slingshot himself past Cape Finisterre, or definitely lose some time and sail further out into the ocean to avoid the area completely. He chooses to take the risk in the bay.
Side note, the Bay of Biscay is a wide, concave sweep of water that stretches around the western coast of France and along the northern coast of Spain. Combine this geography with the prevailing westerly winds that sweep in from the Atlantic, and you have one long, 310-mile lee shore. The bay is notorious for its stormy waters, driven up as the Atlantic Ocean meets the shallower continental shelf of the bay. Modern yachts with their efficient rigs and their engines should not have the same problems of a sailboat, particularly if they use weather forecasts carefully. Cape Finisterre is a rock-bound peninsula on the west coast of Galicia, Spain. This cape is a renowned area for strong winds, typically blowing several forces more than forecast, and the area that the sailors were told to avoid. Back to the story.
Soon after making his choice, the Napoleon Solo is experiencing about a second of hang time as it goes through 10-foot waves on a regular basis. The sound inside of the boat is deafening as it gets beat by wave after wave. This happens for hours, so long in fact that Callahan actually goes to sleep listening to the sound of oil bottles shattering and pots and pans smashing against each other. When he wakes up, he sees some more of his gear floating in a pool of water. It's never a good thing when a pool of water is inside the boat, so he springs out of bed. He manages to find a crack in his boat's hull that's growing with every wave that smashes into it. Repairs are quickly made, and he spends the next 2 days cautiously sailing to the coast of Spain. Callahan makes his way to La Coruna, Spain. Now that he doesn't have to worry about sinking, he has time to inspect his boat. He determines that the most likely scenario is that he must have ran into some ocean debris, and he came to this conclusion because the hull of the boat was covered in dents. Within 24 hours of him mooring up in La Coruna, 7 other racers have found themselves there for a variety of reasons. 2 of the racers were hit by cargo ships, others have large mechanical issues, and some are just fed up with the race. It was at this point that Callahan knew his race was finished. He needed to focus on getting repairs done. With very little money to his name and no ability to speak Spanish, just getting repairs would be a big undertaking by itself. It takes 4 weeks for repairs to be completed and to get the Napoleon Solo seaworthy again. At this point, Callahan realizes that he has a bit of a predicament. He is unsure whether he has enough supplies and money to get to the Caribbean, but he definitely knows he doesn't have enough to get home. The mooring lines are pulled up, and the one-man crew of the Napoleon Solo has become a crew of 2, with the addition of a French woman named Catherine. She doesn't have a lot of experience, but she has a great attitude, and some help is better than no help at all. They sail along the coast into Portuguese waters, make their way to Lisbon. From Lisbon, they go to Madeira, and from Madeira, they exit Portuguese waters and enter Spanish ones. Specifically, they made their way to the island of Tenerife in Spain. This trip was expected to be a 2-week sail, but ended up being a 6-week endeavor. At the conclusion of this, Callahan and Catherine go their separate ways, and he finds himself alone with the Napoleon Solo. He spends some time bouncing from port to port in Spanish waters, telling sea stories to the locals in broken Spanish and rough sign language. He debates mooring up the Solo for the winter, but money's running thin, and he believes there are better work opportunities for him in the Caribbean. Plus, he's worried about the old sailor's trope of pulling into a port with the intention of staying a week or 2 and ending up there for years. Callahan is truly a sailor at heart, and because of that, he faces the sailor's dilemma. You need ports, but you love the sea. It's a vicious cycle. When you sail, you're looking forward to port, and when you're at port, you can't wait to get back on the water. At this point in the year, Everyone that wanted to go to the Caribbean is long gone. So this trip is going to be one that he will have to make alone. With the repairs on his boat complete and a pilot chart promising relatively safe winds and seas, he doesn't believe it'll be a difficult sail for him, and in his own words, it'll be a milk run. It's the night of January 29th, and beautiful stars pepper the sky. The sails are hoisted, and he sails out to the harbor. The Napoleon solo is pointed in the direction of the Caribbean. Damn, it feels good to be back on the water. This concludes part 1 about Mr. Callahan's harrowing experience. Part 2 will be out at the same time next week, and I hope you tune in to hear it. If you like the episode, then give the podcast a follow on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and share it with your friends. It really helps. This is Myths, History, and D&D, and I hope you tune in for the next episode.